The historian H.W. Brands basically characterizes the Civil War as the culmination of this multi generational democratic revolution. And the reason he characterizes it like that is remember that over the last half century, at least if you're looking at the 1800s, we've seen the slow but steady march towards greater and more expansive democracy. From the Constitution, which remember wasn't all that democratic, to Thomas Jefferson, to Andrew Jackson, to the 15th Amendment, we've seen the slow and steady expansion of democracy. But remember, during Reconstruction, there's some pushback. And what happens in 1877 is that democracy, to a certain extent, takes a backseat to other things going on. But remember, you can kind of think of one of the great revolutions in the 19th century as being this democratic revolution. It's not a revolution that occurs on a particular day or time. It's a revolution that takes place over a few years. But I said one of two great revolutions. Because the other great revolution that Brands talks about is a capitalist revolution, an economic revolution. And that's kind of how you can think of the Gilded Age. It's a period of time that historians can kind of agree to disagree on. So some historians kind of say the Gilded Age runs from 1865 to 1896. Others kind of date it as running until the early 1900s. It's kind of like the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. It's a squishy period of time that we sort of define based upon generalized themes. If you were to ask people what those themes are, they might struggle. I would struggle. It's kind of hard to label entire generations or centuries of history in just a couple of words, but I think you might have a feel for what the Gilded Age is all about based upon a lot of the movies and television shows set within that time period. This is the world of the movie Titanic or Downton Abbey. It's this world that just seems spectacular and ostentatious, where the wealthy are super wealthy. And not only do they have rather large families, they have entire armies of domestic servants. And of course, it's the world of absolutely amazing facial hair. Yes, I know I picked a really inconvenient time to trim my beard, but oh well, I feel inadequate. But if you look up the road in and around Asheville, North Carolina, you can find actually kind of like a temple to the Gilded Age. For those of you who don't know, this is the Biltmore House. If you don't know that, by the way, probably Asheville's tourism department hasn't done their job. So the Biltmore House, for those of you who don't know, was built by, I think, the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, for those of you who don't know, Vanderbilt is actually a family headed by the first real American robber baron. And if you look, Biltmore Estate is actually modeled on an old European palace called the Palace of Versailles. So these robber barons self-consciously were emulating European royalty. Now, the fact that Americans should try to emulate European royalty in either, their digs or fashion or whatever else is kind of, incredible in and of itself. But it's even more incredible when you think of the fact that Cornelius Vanderbilt wasn't incredibly highborn himself. Most of the robber barons, most of the class of these super wealthy individuals that sort of come of age during the Gilded Age are not necessarily people who come from what we would call the upper class. Now, that being said, that's just one complication we have to talk about with the Gilded Age. But the other complication is this. If you think about what the word gilded means, for those of you who like jewelry, you'll be able to tell me immediately what gilded is. If you have a gilded piece of jewelry, what that means is that there's gold on the outside, but not on the inside. And the fact that we call it the Gilded Age is kind of a political statement. to a certain extent. The phrase Gilded Age was actually devised by American novelist Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain. Speaking of amazing facial hair, just look at that mustache. Okay, mustache shouldn't be done. But in any case, the Gilded Age, the phrase the Gilded Age, is used satirically by Twain in a short story entitled The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And the basic rundown of that satire is that to outsiders, if you're looking at it superficially, the Gilded Age looks like this. It looks pretty on the outside. But if you inspect it at a deeper level, the Gilded Age is also associated with things that aren't as pretty. Child labor. People working long hours, people getting sick because of working very dangerous jobs and not having adequate health care or any health care in some respects. There are also things that, to a certain extent, still trouble us today. And that's something to kind of to think about when we're talking about the Gilded Age, because to Twain, the Gilded Age looked pretty on the outside, but it was very not hollow, but it was very brittle on the inside. One of the things that we associate with the Gilded Age is the development of American capitalism. And remember that in capitalism, there are winners and losers. That's part of, that's the system by design. And so, one thing to think about when we're talking about this time period is who are the people who really benefit from these economic developments, and who are the people who lose out. And what I would also ask you to do is to sort of keep an open mind, because in many cases, the winners and losers of the Gilded Age might actually surprise you, or at the very least, you can still kind of debate, how people benefit from the development of capitalism and how people lose out. But really, to sort of set the stage for the Gilded Age and the development of capitalism, we also have to talk about something that's kind of related. Speaking of metal, we're not going to talk about gold. We're going to talk about heavy metal, specifically steel. So this is going to be a brief talk on America and the Second Industrial Revolution. So if you're looking at the Gilded Age, this period from roughly 1865 until 1896, you actually see a really amazing story. It's the story of how the United States, which began as this backwater, colonial, provincial hick town, it's the story of how the United States goes from being that to becoming the most industrialized country in human history. If you look at the United States circa the early 19th century, it was lagging behind the other European powers. And that shouldn't surprise us, right? In the early 19th century, the United States had, only recently become independent. And if you look at the early 19th century, there's really only one country that we can kind of characterize as being industrial in any real degree, and that's, of course, Great Britain. But Great Britain is eventually gets competition from some other European powers. But if you look at this fancy schmancy chart, you notice that around 1860, something starts to change. The United States, let's just say that the United States gets some industrial steroids injected into its economy, and it starts to rapidly outpace Great Britain. And then by 1913, 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the United States actually outpaces Britain in terms of per capita industrialization. So in your portfolio, I would like you guys to give me a one-sentence answer as to why that would be the case, why we see this dramatic change starting around the 1860s. Gee, I wonder what answer I'm looking for. Now, before we go into too much depth on the second industrial revolution, we have to understand what the first industrial revolution was really all about. And when you think of the industrial revolution, just in general, what you might think of might be images like this, where you see smokestacks, you see assembly lines, you see Ford Model Ts rolling out, maybe like once every 30 seconds practically. You think of, metal music, you think of sparks flying. Those are kind of the things that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, I think, in pop culture. But we're not really talking about this, at least not yet. When we're looking at the first Industrial Revolution, we're thinking of images more like this. This is actually, by the way, ground zero for America's Industrial Revolution. We don't really become industrialized until the American Civil War, but we do see, at least on a smaller scale, the developments of some factories, starting actually in the late 18th century. So, for those of you who have been waiting patiently for yet another Rhode Island moment in the course, boy, you're in luck today, because this is our last Rhode Island moment in the course. The previous Rhode Island moment, of course, was when Rhode Island refused to ratify the Constitution. Well, this Rhode Island moment is actually, more prestigious, I guess, because this is a photograph of Slatersville, Rhode Island. Not Slaughtersville, Rhode Island. That would actually be pretty metal if it was called that. Slatersville, Rhode Island is named after the first American industrialist, Samuel Slater, who establishes the first factory in the United States. I'll explain the air quotes in just a second. But this is a factory, guys. No, it's not a dormitory. No, it's not like a condo. This is a factory right here. You don't have smokestacks, but really what a factory is a site where you bring a lot of people to help in the manufacture of some product. So that's really what you need. You need a large building. That's better. Kind of gets cold if it rains. You need a fairly large workforce. And remember, because of interchangeable parts, that other very important Eli Whitney invention, the idea of industrial production is that your workforce doesn't have to be skilled. You just need a lot of people to help. So you need those two things. You need people, you need a building, and finally, you need some kind of source of power or energy. Now, eventually, I'm sure a lot of you know that you have wood and coal fire furnaces, but that's not really what we're talking about at this time. Most of the early factories were called mills, partially because the way they sort of generated power is that they would be located next to a river. And the machinery, such that it would be powered by a water wheel that would be turned as the river would flow. That's how it would work. And also, it's important to think about the fact that with the first industrial revolution, we're really just talking about one product. Textiles. The first industrial revolution was all about textiles. But still, just in one product, the global economy was revolutionized because of this sort of revolution in how textiles were produced. So, at this point, you're probably thinking, oh, Mr. Dry, you're killing me. I don't care about textiles. I don't care about factories. Who cares about any of this? And of course, if you ask that question, you're going to have to basically dominoes, and you have to ask about who cares about really anything at all in history. But what I would say is that even if you don't care about textiles, the fact is that textiles have to come from somewhere. And that somewhere is cotton, and more specifically, cotton grown in the Deep South. So the first industrial revolution unwittingly leads to the expansion of cotton production, and of course, with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, the expansion of chattel slavery in the South. But because Britain is kind of the top dog in the first industrial revolution, it means that the British are, making extraordinary profits. And even though Great Britain is to a certain extent one of the smaller, less populated European powers, the rapid advances created by the first industrial revolution leads to Britain becoming the wealthiest country in the world throughout most of the 19th century. It's what allows the British Empire to become a thing, more or less. So the fact that just in one product, you have this economic revolution that really does span the entire globe. So Slatersville is named for this individual right here, Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater, I referred to him earlier, and I said that he was an American industrialist. That's half true. So Samuel Slater was actually somebody who got his start in Great Britain, working in textile mills there. And he realized that there was a market for textile mills in the United States. The problem for Samuel Slater and for the United States is that technology like the spinning jenny or plans for or designs for textile mills are state secrets. And any divulging of those state secrets is a criminal offense, subject to capital punishment. So if anybody is found in possession of those designs or plans, and let's say they are taking a trip to another country, they could be arrested and potentially sentenced to death. So what Samuel Slater does is that he memorizes the designs for a number of spinning jennies and textile mills, and basically travels to the United States, contracts with a local firm, and establishes the first textile mill in Rhode Island. But even though this is kind of one of those America moments, the first major factory in the United States, it's important to kind of contextualize this for what it is. And that is that you could argue that this is America's first step in the Industrial Revolution, but you could also argue that this is kind of a byproduct of the British Industrial Revolution, because it is a British industrialist who ultimately has to establish it, and he establishes it because he thinks that he can basically run his textile mills more efficiently than the ones in England. So even our Industrial Revolution is kind of a consequence of Britain's monopoly on the first Industrial Revolution. So here's some technologies that we kind of associate with the first Industrial Revolution. Technologies, practices, that kind of thing. What I would say is that we've gone over a lot of them, but not all of them. And so if you are unsure of any of these things, I would go and look them up. And so because I think you will be responsible for understanding the significance of each of these things on your unit test. So there are a couple of other developments that we need to talk about right quick. The first is really the development of instantaneous communication through the telegraph. The telegraph was a development by Samuel Morse in which you can send electronic impulses over a cable. And if you basically create kind of a codified systemic way of communicating with those electrical impulses, a la Morse code, then you can basically send messages from point A to point B instantaneously. I didn't really talk too much about this, but a lot of strategy, a lot of battles and campaigns in the Civil War depended very heavily on the use of the telegraph. The fact that you could now send messages instantaneously from point A to point B as long as you were near a telegraph wire. And here's something that's really cool. So the telegraph was so significant that starting, I think, in the year around the 1840s, you had efforts to basically establish a transatlantic telegraph cable that would connect Great Britain and her former colonies. And so, actually, there were a couple of different attempts, because after laying this, this probably a 2,000 mile long plus cable on the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean, apparently, for for whatever reason, it didn't work out. It corroded. So they had to lay another one, I think. Uh, but once that line was established, suddenly there was the possibility for instantaneous communication between the United States and Europe. In other words, I know that we kind of think of the internet as kind of being like the beginning of instantaneous communication all over the world. But to be honest, the internet really hasn't improved very much over the telegraph. What the internet has really done is it's made for instantaneous communication to be more accessible by a larger number of people, but it really hasn't improved upon the speed, which is something cool to think about. We'll come back to the significance of the transatlantic telegraph in a number of different situations going forward, but it also the telegraph in general also means that financial transactions increase in significance and also accessibility. Because suddenly, if you are an investor living in Hicktown, Colorado, as long as you were near a telegraph station, you too could participate in the stock market and invest in businesses. Whereas before the telegraph, you actually had to write your stockbroker, or you had to travel to a major financial center like New York or Chicago. Now it means that a larger number of Americans can participate in the market. And we'll come back to this again extensively in this unit. The second important piece of technology that we associate, or sorry, let me back up. That is kind of the technology of the first industrial revolution. Now let's talk about the second industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution is all about steel. Now, steel itself is an invention of the second industrial revolution. It comes about as a result of what's called the Bessemer process, devised by Henry Bessemer. Basically, what this does, and I'm not as well versed in science as I would like to be, so some of you can laugh at this hilariously inadequate description. But basically, what the Bessemer process does is it takes raw pig iron and ejects the impurities out of it. Because iron, iron ore, actually has a number of different, it has a large number of impurities because it's extracted from the earth, from rock, and so those impurities can cause iron to corrode. It also can sometimes make it brittle and weak in some cases. So what the Bessemer process does is, using superheated gas, it ejects those impurities from pig iron, and what you're left with is basically refined steel. So, big whoop, right? Why is that important? Well, steel is twice as strong as iron, but it's also 8 times lighter. So what steel actually does is that it allows us to reach for the skies. And I mean that quite literally. Steel is what allows for the development of skyscrapers. And so the Bessemer process quickly allows for cities to be built vertically, especially newer cities, especially in the West and Midwest, like Chicago. It's not a coincidence that some of the first and largest skyscrapers are built in newer cities like Chicago. So steel is important for allowing us to build up. It's also important for allowing us to build out. So the thing is that with a steel railroad, for example, as opposed to an iron railroad, you can actually have more weight run along the railroad track. So during the early 19th century, I'm sure that you guys remember, railroads were still kind of an emerging, almost primitive technology. They were very useful for moving goods, but I mean, look at this picture right here. I'm not really sure that you'd want to ever take your date on a train, or you'd want to travel with your family on a train, because, I mean, It probably beats the alternatives, but it sure don't look comfortable. But because of steel railroads and also because of the development of coal-powered steam engines, suddenly trains can get bigger and more comfortable. If you were a 19th century robber baron, by the way, this was the equivalent of a private jet or yacht. This is a Pullman car, this luxury railroad car. And apparently, if you wanted to go somewhere and you had the money, you would basically hook your personal Pullman car up to a train and travel in style. By the way, the Pullman car kind of becomes like the symbol of luxury for a lot of the robber barons during this time period. But the thing is that the development of coal-powered technology is really significant because beforehand, um, basically, steam engines were typically powered by burning wood. But coal is actually, I mean, coal is terrible for the lungs, right? But it's more than twice as effective as wood in terms of energy output. So the thing is that the second industrial revolution is a revolution that's powered by steel, um, and coal and petroleum power. Next time, we'll open up with a brief description of electrical power and also talk a little bit more about the robber barons themselves.